This video is for educational and historical purposes only. It may contain scenes some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
In the American Civil War, the ranks can become a little bit confusing. Both Union and Confederate sides will use ranks of similar sorts. The lowest ranking officers would be your privates, your corporals, and your sergeants, your non-commissioned officers. The next step up from there would be your line officers, men who are lieutenants and captains. Then your field grade officers, your majors, your lieutenant colonels, and your colonels. And then finally, you move up into the higher ranks of the generals. Now, each army does have different sets of insignia for their ranks. As we look back to our non-commissioned officers, most of those men would have chevrons on their arms, 2 for corporals, 3 for sergeants. Moving up to your lieutenants is where things start to become a little bit more complicated for the Union and the Confederates. The Union would have shoulder boards normally, with small bars inside of these boards showing if you are a lieutenant or a captain. The Confederates on the other side usually didn't have shoulder boards, though some did. Most of the Confederates, though, would wear their insignia of first lieutenant, second lieutenant, or captain up on their collars. Your field grade officers would be your majors, your lieutenant colonels, and your colonels. The lieutenant colonels and your majors, they would have oak leaves inside of their shoulder boards, and then you would have a full bird as a full bird colonel for the Union. Now the Confederates, they would normally use single stars for majors, 2 stars for lieutenant colonel, and then 3 for colonel. Moving over to the generals, it becomes much more complicated. For the North, again, we're going to use 1 star for a brigadier general, 2 for a major general, and 3 for a lieutenant general. To denote a Southern general, Confederate armies normally use 3 stars with a laurel wreath around these stars. You would know that they're a general, but you would not know what rank of general they would be, because those 3 stars denoted the ranks of brigadier, major, lieutenant, and full generals. To confuse you just a little bit more, Robert E. Lee, a full general, would actually wear the insignia of a colonel rather than a full-rank general in the Confederate Army. Now, it wasn't just chevrons and shoulder boards that would denote if you were an officer or an NCO. The Confederates predominantly would use Austrian braids, ornate braiding that would be on the cuffs of each one of their officers' coats, and this would be one way to show if you were a lieutenant all the way up to a general. In 1863, the principal army of the North, the Army of the Potomac, instituted what were known as corps badges. Corps badges are the forerunners of our modern divisional patches. These corps badges would denote which of the 7 infantry corps a unit belonged to. They would be small symbols, a little circle for the 1st corps, a trefoil or a shamrock for the 2nd corps, and beyond. They would be red, they'd be white, they'd be blue, to tell you exactly which division these men served in, the 1st, the 2nd, or the 3rd. The corps badges are a key identifying feature on a soldier as they're marching across the battlefield, because most of the men in the Union Army were dressed in blue. But they're also a symbol for men to rally behind. These corps badges were a point of pride with the Union soldiers all the way up through their veteran years until the day they die. Beyond the corps badges, there are many identifying insignia for both the Northern and the Southern armies, including a flaming cannonball, which would help to show that you are part of the Ordnance Department, or crossed axes to show that you're a pioneer. In the end, many people think that ranks and insignia have more to do with the pomp and circumstance of war, but the reality is that ranks and insignia are an important part of every army and battle.
In June of 1862, new commander of the Army of Northern Virginia, Robert E. Lee, whipped, demoralized, and pushed away from Richmond, the Union host under George McClellan. After that, Lee moves northward. He wins at Cedar Mountain, wins at Second Manassas, and then decides to invade the north, pushes into Maryland, crosses the Potomac River, hoping maybe to get people to flock to his cause. His army will swell inside Maryland. While the Union host, now under George McClellan, will pursue after Robert E. Lee, the Union gets a lucky stroke. While in Frederick, Maryland, about 20 miles away from here, the Union finds an order, a lost order Order 191, which detailed that Robert E. Lee's army was split up into several pieces. So little respect did he have for the audacity of his opponent, George McClellan. Armed with information about Robert E. Lee's plan, George McClellan moves with uncharacteristic speed, pushing westward against the passes at South Mountain and Crampton's Gap, Fox's Gap, Turner's Gap will all fall to the Union late on September 14th, 1862. Robert E. Lee doesn't know what's happening, but he knows he needs to concentrate his army, and he's bringing the various elements together, and eventually they're going to concentrate outside of Sharpsburg, Maryland, where we stand along the banks of Antietam Creek. In coming to the Battle of Antietam, or the Battle of Sharpsburg, depending on which side you're on, the Union Army has about 80,000 soldiers, and the Confederates only have about 40,000 soldiers. Lee is at a numerical disadvantage. He's got a big swollen river to his back, the Potomac River, but yet he stands his ground. The Battle of Antietam, all fought on one calendar day, will devolve into 4 phases. They're going to fight behind me in the cornfield, in the environs around there. Later in the morning, they're going to fight around the West Woods off to my right. Later that morning and into the early afternoon, they're going to fight for a sunken road, now known as the Bloody Lane, and overlapping with that and into the afternoon, they're going to fight at and around the Burnside Bridge. Let me go into each of those phases. The fighting starts early in the morning, where the Union men, Hooker's men, the 1st Corps, followed by the Union 12th Corps, 20,000 soldiers are going to push through and around the cornfield, while Stonewall Jackson's men are going to push back with artillery, with infantry, and Jackson is taxed to every last bit of strength he has. They are pulling Confederates from the right over to the left to bolster Jackson. Ultimately, Jackson's line will hold, just barely hold, right as the next phase starts, where the Union 2nd Corps arrives, and that Union 2nd Corps will split so that some of the men fight in the West Woods, some of the men fight over toward the Bloody Lane. The Unionists that went to the West Woods met disaster behind the Dunker Church at the hands of a powerful Confederate counterattack. The Unionists who attacked the Bloody Lane found that the Confederates were not particularly strong there in that otherwise strong position. Ultimately, the Union was able to flank the Bloody Lane, get around it, and the Confederates fell back from there. And in bloody fighting, the Union captured that position. In the meantime, the Union is struggling, the 9th Corps under Ambrose Burnside, struggling to capture or get around Burnside Bridge, which ultimately they do after several unsuccessful attempts at 10 in the morning, at noon, and finally at 1 in the afternoon, the Union crosses Burnside Bridge, pushes the Confederates away, and disaster is imminent for the South. After capturing the Burnside Bridge, the Union pushed on. They are about to cut off the only route of retreat for Robert E. Lee's army. It is all but certain disaster for the Confederates. They're starting to fall back en masse. Just as the Union began to advance, however, with raw recruits on their far left flank, on that flank arrives A.P. Hill's Light Division, just arriving from Harper's Ferry, just when and just where they were needed. They hit the Union flank with a fury. The Union flank will crumble. That will force the rest of the 9th Corps back, and ultimately the Union movement just stalls. The Battle of Antietam ends there. It is the bloodiest single day in all of American history. 23,000 soldiers killed, wounded, captured, or missing. The next day, both sides were so worn out that there was no fighting on the 18th. But the Union does pursue. They pursue the Confederates as they're trying to get back into Virginia. Now West Virginia, there's a fight at the Battle of Shepherdstown, but the Southern invasion is done. They have been repelled, and this is enough for Abraham Lincoln to take the bold stroke of issuing his preliminary Emancipation Proclamation, which will suddenly change the war. Starting on January 1st, 1863, the war will no longer be just about saving and preserving a Union, but rather about freeing the slaves. The Battle of Antietam also, with that move, kept European powers out. It is therefore one of the most important days in American history.
So I'm standing in front of the monument to the 54th Massachusetts Volunteer Infantry, or the Robert Gould Shaw Memorial here in Boston, Massachusetts. This is a monument to the 1st Black Regiment that was raised in early 1863 following Lincoln's issuance of the Emancipation Proclamation. It's the brainchild of Governor John Andrew, who from the beginning of the war pressed Abraham Lincoln and the rest of the government to recruit black soldiers for the Union war effort. Of course, Lincoln refused to do so until early 1863, and with the go-ahead, Governor Andrew commenced with the raising of the 54th, as well as the 55th and the 5th Massachusetts Cavalry. All 3 of them were all-black regiments. Most of the men that served in the 54th and the 55th actually came from outside of Massachusetts. These were free black men raised in other northern states. The reason for that, there are a number of reasons. First, there were actually relatively few black or free blacks in Boston, in Massachusetts, that could fill up the ranks. Many African Americans here in the free black community in Boston were suspicious of a war effort that up until now had refused to recruit them as soldiers. By the spring of 1863, the 54th Massachusetts was sent off down to South Carolina, off of the sea islands of South Carolina and Georgia. They first made their way to Beaufort, South Carolina, and by June, early July of 1863, had taken part in a number of engagements on James Island, of course, the famous raid and burning of Darien, Georgia. But its claim to fame comes on July 18th, 1863, with the storming of Battery Wagner, just outside of Charleston, South Carolina. In this failed assault, the commander, Robert Gould Shaw, was killed, along with roughly 40% of the attacking force. So for many viewers, the monument behind me conjures up perhaps memories of the movie Glory, which was released in 1989. Very successful movie starring Matthew Broderick and Denzel Washington and Morgan Freeman, which told the story of the 54th Massachusetts. In my mind, it's still one of the best Civil War movies out there, but like any Hollywood movie, it does play loose at times with the actual history. There are a couple points, I guess, that should be noted here. I think most importantly, the movie Glory focuses on sort of a small group of fugitive slaves that served in the 54th Massachusetts. And while there were certainly a small number of former slaves who managed to get into this first black regiment, the vast majority of these men were free blacks born in northern states who were recruited in early 1863 to serve in this regiment. So that's one example. I think another example has to do with the pay crisis that the movie briefly alludes to as the unit is coming together in training. There's a famous moment where Colonel Shaw tears up his pay voucher in protest over the unequal pay that black soldiers would receive from the federal government. That was certainly the case. What the movie sort of leaves out is that even after its failed assault at Battery Wagner, for the next close to a year, up until June 1864, the 54th Massachusetts and many other black regiments protested the unequal pay. They refused to accept the unequal pay from the federal government. And for the units raised here in Massachusetts, they even refused payment from the governor himself, who wanted to make up the difference. I think it's safe to say that Glory put these men back on the historical map, and certainly it's the case that when most Americans, when they think of black soldiers or black Union soldiers in the Civil War, they think of the 54th Massachusetts. And that, of course, is now serving as a springboard for research into other black regiments that may not have experienced the war in the same way as these men from Boston did.
The popular image of the Civil War soldier is that of a young man wearing blue or gray, standing shoulder to shoulder with his comrades and marching into a great battle. However, only a small portion of the soldier's life was spent in combat. Between the battles and marches were vast stretches of inactivity that were marked by three things: duty, drill, and diversion. The day begins at dawn with the bugler blowing reveille. At this, all the men rise from their tents and fall in for roll call. At this point, men are assigned to the various fatigue duties, manual labor that keeps the army running. This can include cooking, cleaning, building roads. In the cases of artillery or cavalry, this includes the care and grooming of horses. Another form of duty vital to the Army's existence was guard duty. Detachments of troops were stationed not only throughout the entire camp of the Army, but also at the far reaches of that camp, often only a rifle shot away from the enemy. Those troops not assigned to duty would stay in camp for drill. Drill is an essential part of the soldier's life. This is how he learns to handle his weapon, how to march in formation, and how to execute the various battlefield maneuvers that will be used in combat. Drill can be broken down into three various forms. Drill by the squad, in which a non-commissioned officer leads 6 or 8 men in practicing of maneuvers or the manual of arms. Drill by the company, in which a company commander or a captain leads up to 100 men in battlefield maneuvers. And then finally, drill by the battalion, in which all 10 companies of a regiment are formed on the parade ground and execute the vast sweeping maneuvers that come to mind when we think of Civil War battles. When not drilling or performing some other vital task for the Army, men had precious few forms of diversion with which to occupy their time. The most popular by far was reading and writing. Men were desperate for news from home or the outside world, and they got it from whatever source they could, whether it was an often read newspaper or a cherished letter from a loved one. Men could also be found playing cards or chess, or also involved in some of the various social clubs that were formed throughout the Army, whether it was Bible study groups, glee clubs, or drama troupes that would perform on special occasions. Whether he wore blue or gray, these are the activities that filled the soldier's life between the great battles that decided the fate of our nation.
When Stonewall Jackson was a young man at West Point, he kept a book of maxims that he would write down favorite sayings and quotes in. And one of them particularly stuck out for him. You may be whatever you resolve to be. And that was a quote that really sums up the way he approached his entire life. Through that sense of resolve, he could make himself into whatever he resolved to be. He came from very humble beginnings in what was then Western Virginia, in Clarksburg. There, he was orphaned at a very early age, but that sense of resolve shaped him into a fine, upstanding young man in the community, where he was even elected constable. He was raised by bachelor uncles, but that sense of resolve helped him not to live in an animal house-like environment, but instead be respectable and have a sense of business, how to handle horses. That sense of resolve shaped him into such a fine young man that he earned an appointment to the West Point Military Academy, where he found himself woefully underprepared for the education that they offered him. But again, that sense of resolve helped him buckle down and become an excellent student. He went from being near the bottom of his class over the course of 4 years to being near the top. Classmates said that if they'd had to go for a 5th year, he would have been the top student because of that dedication and resolve. After graduation, like so many of his classmates, he was sent off to the Mexican War, where that sense of resolve helped him do his duty under fire. He was eventually commended 3 separate times by the General-in-Chief of the Army for work that he did on the battlefield under fire, and that sense of resolve putting him where he needed to be in the crucible of battle. After the war, he took a job with the Virginia Military Institute because they needed a war hero. There they asked him to teach natural history and philosophy, today what we would call physics. Jackson was woefully underprepared to teach physics, but that sense of resolve pushed him to improve over the course of a 10-year career. And so students went from calling him Tom Fool to actually respecting him at the end of that decade. It might also be because his other subject was artillery, and there Jackson was a genius. You couldn't find better artillery instruction anywhere in the country than you could at VMI from Major Thomas Jackson. Then Civil War broke out. Jackson initially opposed secession, but once Virginia seceded, he went with his home state. In July of 1861, that sense of resolve put him on the crest of Henry House Hill. There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Let us resolve to die here, and we shall conquer. And as the Confederate line reformed around him, the tide of battle turned, and the Confederates won the day, even as Jackson won one of the most famous nicknames in military history, Stonewall Jackson. That sense of resolve would drive him up and down in the Shenandoah Valley in the spring of 1862, where he would defeat 3 armies that outnumbered him more than 3-1, covering distances so vast, so quickly, that his men earned the nickname Jackson's Foot Cavalry. When he teams up with Robert E. Lee, they string together a series of victories that have been called a model partnership, turning the tide of the war in the East. But that sense of resolve also puts Jackson, in May of 1863, in a spot no lieutenant general should be, between the lines doing reconnaissance on May 2nd during the Battle of Chancellorsville. He finds himself accidentally wounded by his own men, that sense of resolve driving him to push forward an attack that had bogged down under darkness. So perhaps Jackson's resolve, that guiding principle, might also have been his fatal flaw. We ask you to consider Jackson's words for yourself, because you too may be whatever you resolve to be.
The story of the respective home fronts during the Civil War is a very interesting and complicated one. The first thing people need to understand is that there are very different experiences depending on whether you live in the United States or the Confederacy. There are some commonalities. People on both sides became used to much more intrusive central governments. Both Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis set aside the writ of habeas corpus at one time or another. On the United States side, of course, there was disruption. Congress passed income tax legislation and conscripted Union men into the Army, although if you live in the United States, you only had about a 1 in 2 chance of doing military service because the war didn't call on a higher percentage than that. The United States economy put in a very impressive performance. It proved fully up to the task of producing the vast amount of material that the United States military forces needed, while also producing all the civilian goods that society would normally want. It had a tremendous economic engine that hummed along during the war, and although inflation went up to about 80%, it did so without any kind of government intervention in the economy, and that's a rate about equal to what happened in World War II and World War I, with much more governmental intervention. On the Confederate side, there's wide-scale economic dislocation, tremendous damage done to the transportation and communication infrastructure. It took a great deal more intervention on the part of the Confederate government because the industrial base was so much smaller. The Confederacy actually set up state-sponsored industries to produce armaments and powder and other things during the war. There was nothing equivalent in the United States. There are also an array of both monetary taxes and eventually a tax in kind where the government would take a portion of crops and other things. The difference for women's experiences in the two nations was extreme. The vast majority of women in the United States carried on generally as they would in life, although many farm women assumed a much harder burden of work when their soldier husbands were off with the Army, but they didn't experience the economic hardships that hit women, especially poorer women, in the Confederacy. There were extreme shortages of food and even of very basic things such as clothing on the Confederate home front. And every level of government in the Confederacy stepped in to provide what we would call welfare type assistance for poorer people, especially soldiers' wives in the Confederacy. There were times when women rioted in the Confederacy, especially in Richmond in 1863, because of shortages of food and other hardships that had been visited upon them by the war. But the real difference on the civilian side in the Confederacy was the profound dislocation to the normal activities of social life that the presence of United States armies brought. There are thousands of white refugees in the Confederacy, hundreds of thousands of black refugees in the Confederacy. In fact, the unraveling of the slave-based society in the Confederacy is one of the major themes of the home front on the Confederate side. As Union military forces penetrated deeper into the nation, it disrupted white control over African Americans, even as it disrupted the economy and transportation and almost every other element. In other words, did exactly the thing that the secessionists had hoped to avoid in leaving the Union in the first place. They brought on a war that brought armies to the Confederacy, that brought tremendous dislocation to almost every element of their economic, social, and political structures.
The soldiers of both North and South that served in the American Civil War obviously served with a number of reasons in mind. One such factor that is often overlooked is the idea of religion or spiritualism, factors which many of them had grown up with in their youth. Whether a recruit was Protestant or Catholic or Jewish, many of them served with a similar conviction in mind, regardless of what side they were on. They all thought that God was on their side. And after all, both the Union and the Confederacy hosted national days of prayer, national days of fast, and numerous religious services. But what motivated these religiously devout people to embark in this wholesale slaughter of fellow Americans? It's an important question for us to consider, even 150 years later. There are many people throughout the North who go to war for numerous reasons. A small number of them include those that are opposed to the institution of slavery, known as abolitionists. They believe that this war comes about as a form of punishment coming down from God for the sins of slavery and for allowing this nation that prides itself on freedom from allowing it to grow and expand into new territories. But for a large portion of the Northern people, they think of even higher ideals in mind. The idea of union served as a beacon of sorts to individual liberty and religious freedom. And Northerners believed that if they could win this war, that they could not only perfect their own society, but pave the way for God's kingdom here on earth. At the same time, Confederates thought that their new nation was the one true Christian nation, and Confederate leaders were not hesitant at all to invoke God's name in their call, either in their Constitution or in their national motto, which was Dio Vindici, meaning with God as our defender. At the same time, Southerners used numerous Bible passages to promote and defend the institution of slavery, attempting to assert a moral and spiritual backbone to the institution that defined Southern society. Guiding these hundreds of thousands of soldiers out in the field in order to provide spiritual and moral comfort were perhaps as many as 4,000 chaplains of numerous denominations. Some preachers and ministers decided to share the views of their respective countries from the pulpit. Others would actually join troops and go out into the field, some of them even taking up weapons or leading men into combat. One such general was Confederate leader Leonidas Polk, who led men into battle, albeit not that successfully. But even so, like so many of his fellow Confederate soldiers, he too gave up his life in the name of his God and country. Perhaps the most famous of these chaplains is the Catholic priest depicted behind me, a priest by the name of Father William Corby. At the Battle of Antietam in September 1862, as well as the Battle of Gettysburg right here in 1863, he went before his fellow members of the Irish Brigade, and he spoke to them before they were being deployed into battle. In what was perhaps one of the final moments of many of their lives, he went before them, shared in a moment of prayer, gave them the final act of absolution, giving them forgiveness for any of their sins, and he also gave a stern warning to any of those shirkers or potential deserters who turned away in the face of the enemy, that they would not be welcomed into the gates of heaven. This is a very revealing moment in regard to the religious lives of Civil War soldiers. It tells us not only what they were doing and thinking in the final moments of their lives or in this desperate hour of their lifetime, it also tells us about the times in which they grew up, the devout religious societies that they lived in, and the strong conviction that they not only had in their country, but in their God.
Once the Civil War ended, the North had a rather large problem on its hands, and that was what to do with hundreds of thousands of soldiers who had died fighting for the Union during the Civil War. And it was decided pretty early on that the nation needed to begin establishing national cemeteries. This is the first time this was ever done. Cemeteries specifically to house the remains of soldiers who had died fighting for the Union cause. And so starting in 1866, the Quartermaster Department started sending out officers throughout the country to locate the Union remains, specifically in the South where most of the battles had been, to find out initially just how much of a problem there was, how many unburied dead were there. And to do that, they had a special group of men called the Burial Corps. And it's kind of a group that we don't really know too much about. It was a civilian group that was administered by the Quartermaster Department of the Army. And these people, sometimes they were former slaves, sometimes they were immigrants, sometimes they were former Union soldiers, sometimes they were even former Confederate soldiers, would be hired to go out and find the bodies on the battlefield. And so these groups would go out and then they would spread out over a battlefield or a campground, usually several paces apart, and almost like a skirmish line, would comb the battlefields looking for bodies. And when they found a body, the man in charge of the party would then mark it. They would disinter the body, try to see if there was any identification on it. Many of the soldiers, by 1865, when the war ended, were not identified. Even if they had been identified after the battle with maybe a small headboard, a lot of times those headboards simply weren't around a couple of years later once this burial process started. Sometimes animals would kick them over. Sometimes local people would pick them up and use them for firewood. So by the time the burial process started, the large majority of the soldiers buried here could not be identified. Here at Fredericksburg, about 84% of those buried here are considered unknown dead.
It seems strange to us today that the government would only want to bury Union soldiers and not Confederate soldiers. But again, keep in mind this is immediately after a very long, bitter war in which hundreds of thousands of men died. There was hardly a person, either North or South, who hadn't had a brother, a cousin, a father, a son who had been killed in this fighting. And so feelings were still rather harsh from one side to the other. And so it's not surprising then that when the time came to rebury soldiers, that the Northern government was not inclined to pay for the burial of Southern soldiers whom they viewed as traitors. As soon as you enter a cemetery, one of the first things you'll find is a stone or brick lodge next to the entrance, and that was used to house the superintendent whose job it was to take care of the cemetery. As you move up into the cemetery, you'll almost always find a flagpole, often near the entrance or near the center of the cemetery. You'll find, of course, the graves made out of usually some sort of stone. You will find certain ornamental features like stanzas from Theodore O'Hara's poem Bivouac of the Dead. You'll usually find at least one or two monuments. Another thing you'll find are these upright cannon. They were put in the 1880s. Again, it was a standard thing that was done at almost every national cemetery. Also around the 1880s, you had a plaque with the Gettysburg Address on it put into most of these cemeteries. Some features have gone over the years, but by and large, you'll find most of these features in most of the cemeteries.
Coffee became a part of the standard U.S. Army ration in 1832 thanks to President Andrew Jackson. Now, before you get too grateful, remember, Jackson substituted coffee for the soldiers' alcohol ration. Now, as many of us know, caffeine is an excellent stimulant, and Civil War soldiers were no less addicted than people are today to coffee. In fact, even the most religious coffee drinker of today would be hard-pressed to compete with the Civil War soldier in their addiction to caffeine. Like many people, the Civil War soldier began his day with coffee. If there was an early morning march, the first order of business was to boil water and make coffee and get it consumed before getting into line. If there was a halt along the march, the first order of business when the march stopped was to get that hot water going to drink more coffee. In fact, one Union veteran recorded that Civil War soldiers would drop out of the line of march, start a fire, boil up some coffee, and drink some more before they got back into line and catch up with the rest of their comrades. Soldiers going on picket duty would drink coffee before they went out, and soldiers would drink coffee after their shift ended. Put another way, soldiers drank coffee at meals and between meals. Bear in mind that these troops did not have the same access to sugar that we do today. Oh sure, they were issued sugar, but not nearly in large enough quantities to match the sheer volume of coffee they consumed. In order to help their sugar ration go further, Civil War soldiers would keep their coffee and their sugar in the same bag, so that every sip of coffee had just a tiny taste of sugar with it. Also, remember that milk is a luxury during the Civil War in both armies. They could occasionally get condensed milk in cans from sutlers for a very high price, or perhaps they could stop at a farm here like the Mumar farm in Antietam and squeeze milk from a local cow. But these were very rare occurrences. So picture this, most Civil War soldiers are drinking their coffee black with only the tiniest hint of sugar in every drop. Think about that the next time you order your caramel soy macchiato. Unfortunately for Confederate troops, the Union blockade of southern ports greatly hampered the Confederacy's ability to import coffee and sell it for a reasonable price, let alone issue it to troops in the field. As early as January of 1862, coffee rations to Confederate soldiers had to be suspended entirely. British observer Lieutenant Colonel Arthur Fremantle noted in his now famous diary that Confederates exercised their ingenuity in devising substitutes for coffee, grinding up roots and vegetables into a coffee-like substance. Colonel Fremantle admitted, however, that these substitutes were not generally very good. Rye was a popular placeholder, if somewhat dangerous. Rye typically grows along other more poisonous plants, prompting one Richmond newspaper to warn that poisoning is inevitable when drinking rye coffee. Another less poisonous substitute was chicory, which had the benefit of not killing anybody, but also lacked the caffeine content. However, the flavor profiles were similar enough that starting in Louisiana and then spreading across the South, Southerners would use chicory in place of coffee. Chicory remained a popular coffee substitute through the Great Depression and into the 20th century, and is even being infused into bougie coffee blends today. Northerners, on the other hand, had a much easier time of getting coffee, making it a prized commodity to trade during the informal truces that often sprung up between Union and Confederate soldiers on the picket line. Very typically, Union soldiers would trade Northern coffee for Southern tobacco, with both sides being pleased with the result.
Today I'm here to talk to you about farm fences. Anytime you have an agricultural system that are going to combine livestock, animals, and crops, you need some way to separate them. Here in North America, we have farm fences as early as 1632. Now, it changes the paradigm in the old world. In the old world, you had to fence animals in. In the new world, there's so much land, you got to fence them out. So if you're going to build a fence, it's going to determine by what's the purpose, how much material you have, and how much time and effort you want to take to build that fence. The easiest fence you can build is a Virginia worm fence. Take 10 to 12 foot long poles, stack them in a zigzag pattern, and let gravity hold it together. A modification of that Virginia worm fence would be a stake and rider fence. Take that same zigzag pattern, now put a stake at the end and a large rail on top of it. Gravity will hold it in place. As late as 1870, this is the most popular fence in America. It's considered the American fence. Now, the only fence that can compete with that would be the post and rail. Post and rail fence took some work. You had to auger holes in to make room for the rails, and you had to dig fence post holes. You actually save some space, and they tend to last longer. The other kind of fence that are very common are going to be these stone walls that you see. Farmers will clear their fields, they'll take these stones and they'll pile them at the edge of their fields or along boundaries. Now, we can combine fences. We can take the stone wall and we can put a stake and rider fence on top, which makes it horse high and hog tight. And then the last fence would be like a picket fence. Think about a white washed little fence around a vegetable garden around a farmhouse. Now, in the Civil War, whether you're a West Point general or a Civil War soldier, farm fences are part of the tactical terrain of the Civil War battlefield, and they really impact us in four ways. They are concealment, they're cover, they're obstacles, and they also have a factor in command and control, and we'll break this down. Concealment. Concealment's about breaking the line of sight, hiding. We have a great example here at Gettysburg. Brigadier General Alfred Iverson's brigade suffers the highest percentage casualties of any Confederate brigade here at Gettysburg, in part because Union soldiers concealed behind a stone wall will rise up and deliver a deadly flanking fire on Iverson's men. Cover. Cover's a lot like concealment, but now you got to think about hiding. I think one of the best examples we have of concealment are Confederates using the stone wall at the base of Marie's Heights during the Fredericksburg battlefield in December of 1862. Next, we have fences as obstacles. Think about long linear formations coming across these fields. When they run into fences, they slow their momentum down, they sap their energy as they either have to knock them down or take them apart. For an enemy who can keep those fences under fire, they will inflict more casualties. Maybe the greatest example is here at Gettysburg, Union soldiers firing at Confederates, trying to negotiate the post and rail fences on either side of the Emmitsburg Road during what we know as Longstreet's assault or Pickett's charge. Lastly, and perhaps most informally, is in command and control. With these units out here using linear formations, that we have long lines of fences that they can orient their men on as they take them from column of march into line of battle, or if they're falling back, they can rally behind a fence that also provides some cover and concealment as an added benefit. So as we study the Civil War, we can think about farm fences as a simple tool, and in part they are. But for the Civil War soldier, they were an obstacle we considered deliberately or negotiated reactively in the heat of battle.